Well, hi, I think we're going to get started so that we give our speaker plenty of time. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Marian Larson. I'm co-chair of the English department, and I am going to introduce David Berlin in just a second, but I'm going to put in a little plug for the Primetime series. So welcome to the 2012-2013 season of Primetime at the BU Library. And for those of you who have never been to one of these sessions before, Primetime is a year-long celebration of the academic and experiential accomplishments of our faculty, students, staff, and sometimes special speakers. And it's a collaboration between friends of the BU Library and many offices on campus. The next Primetime session is going to be Thursday, November 15th at the same time, the same place. And at that time, we'll hear from Taylor Rafferty and Cassie Erlander, who will share their study abroad experience entitled Ripples and Reflections of Campushood. So that sounds interesting. So today, BU Primetime in the Library and also the English department welcome author and English faculty member David Berlin. David teaches at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, and we need to be kind to him today because he wanted to be there for his kids trick-or-treating last night, so he drove from Appleton this morning. Yes, so see, I figured.
Very early.
David has written 2 books, The End of the Straight and Narrow, which is a collection of short stories, and also A Door in the Ocean, which is his recent memoir. And this morning he'll be sharing his thoughts on memoir writing with us. And I'm also mentioning, here are his 2 books, and these belong to the BU Library. They're still being processed, but they're in the ask status, which means if you wanted to check one of these out, you'd be able to. Should they just talk to you, Anne?
Talk to the reference desk.
Okay, just talk to the reference desk if you'd like to be the first person to check out one or both of these books. So let's welcome David.
Thank you. These are also standard stocking size.
I'm thinking of Christmas. I can probably fit 3 or 4 in any one stocking. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I've known about Bethel for a long time. When I was thinking about looking for a job now 7 years ago, this is a place I actually sort of searched the website to see if maybe you would have job openings. And I ended up not far, just 4 hours or so down the road in Appleton. Even though I had to leave at 4:45 this morning, it's really not that bad of a drive. It's really pretty quick. I get up at 5 most mornings anyway, so it wasn't that much of a difference. And it'll be fine. And since I don't have kids with me tonight, I'll be in a hotel. I can sleep to my heart's content, so I'll make it on the other side. It's fun to be here to talk about the memoir. It's a book or a genre I never expected to work in, and found myself sort of falling backwards into it. But I've since come to really love it, and it's one of those genres that I think deserves a special place in American literature, and has a special place within the realms of people thinking about writing about their spiritual lives and people thinking about spiritual concerns. And so it's an appropriate thing to talk about at a place like Bethel. Are any of you thinking about memoir in sort of vague terms? Maybe you have a story you want to tell, or some sort of nonfiction narrative you want to tell. Maybe some of the things that I will talk about today will give you some sense of how to start to shape that material. And I hope that you'll ask questions. I hope it's not just me up here talking this entire time. That gets pretty boring. My jokes get pretty dumb pretty fast. So I'm a better question answerer than a joke teller. So let me tell you how I came to this genre in the first place. A long time ago, at the end of my first year of graduate school, I saw a flyer advertising a free lunch hosted by a book representative, which a book rep, if you're a grad student, is sort of like a drug rep if you're a med student. They come and they peddle their textbooks and they bring you sandwiches. And back in the 90s, they could hand out more freebies than they can now. And it said, free food and free books if you show up at noon. So I showed up at 11 because I wanted the books and I wanted the food. I canceled my class. I made sure I was the first one through the door, which is something that you do when you only make $8,000 a year as a graduate student, and the professors here can corroborate. By the end of the lunch, I had walked away, or I'd eaten $50 worth of sandwiches, and had walked away with at least $100 worth of free textbooks, all of which were samples. I carried them home to my apartment. I lived at that time in Salt Lake City, Utah. I studied at the University of Utah, and I lived up on this house. I lived in a house up on a hill that overlooked the city and the university and the Great Salt Lake way up in the distance. And I carried these books home, and I swore to myself that I was going to read every one. There's no way that that book rep had wasted her free books or sandwiches on me. When the weekend came, I lay on my bed and opened up my window. I picked up the first book in the stack, and it was just a big textbook of how to write in creative writing. Probably the most boring thing in the world, but I felt dutiful and bound, so I did it. And the first section of the first textbook was a memoir, which I kind of heard about, but hadn't really given much thought to. When you're 24, that was back then, and you're in a graduate program for fiction writing, you tend to think of all other genres as lesser than your own. Memoirs were the kinds of things that politicians wrote, or army generals wrote, or the little old lady down the street that sticks in her drawer and her grandchildren publish it later on. It wasn't something that I felt like I had much of a connection with, except that in this section of this textbook were pieces of memoir or nonfiction written by famous fiction writers. One of them was Raymond Carver, a couple of others, Saul Bellow, and so I said, what the heck, I'll go ahead and read these. The second story that I read in that textbook was by a writer named Michael Gilmore, who is a journalist for Rolling Stone magazine. He still writes for Rolling Stone. He just had a big essay a couple months ago when Warren Zevon died. You saw that. And Michael Gilmore's older brother was Gary Gilmore. You might know who Gary Gilmore is. The professor too. Gary Gilmore was a very famous criminal in the 1970s. He'd been in and out of prison for years. And in 1977, he murdered two men in Provo, Utah, which is an hour south of Salt Lake City, which is where BYU, Brigham Young University, is located. And after a 10-year moratorium on the death penalty, he was the first person executed by firing squad, the first person executed in the country in more than a decade. It caused a huge uproar. If you can imagine the time in our country in which we didn't have cable television or the internet, you just had network TV and newspapers. This was the sort of national consumption for an entire summer. And finally, in 1977 or 78, he was executed by firing squad, which is still something that's available, oddly enough, in Utah for lots of reasons that I won't get into. So I picked up the story, I started to read it, and I was suddenly amazed by what was going on inside of these pages. I lived in Utah by that point for about 9 or 10 months. And like a lot of people who were new to Salt Lake City, I kind of had bought into the cliches of the place. Skiing was good, Great Salt Lake was salty. Probably most importantly, it was where the Mormon church was located, which meant that it was, a number of things. But one of them was it was homogeneous and overly wholesome, and thus essentially kind of boring. It's easy to see Salt Lake City from the outside as a kind of boring place. But reading Michael Gilmore's story, I felt like the scales fell from my eyes, to be biblical about it. I felt suddenly converted. It seemed amazing that Salt Lake City could look the way that it did. And suddenly, this place that seemed homogeneous and boring became the Wild West, just as I read the story. And because I lived in this old house high up on this hill in Salt Lake City, I was able to climb out my window to the fire escape, sort of rickety and not really attached to the wall, and then scramble from there up onto the roof of the house and sit there and look over the entire valley. And you can see, and if you know Salt Lake City, there's the Wasatch Mountains on one side, the Ochre Mountains on the other, Great Salt Lake is out by the Ochres, and then the valley goes all the way south to the point of the mountain where it turns, and then around that point is where you get to Provo. At the point of the mountain is the prison where Gary Gilmore was executed 20-some years before. And in between that was the city, the university where I took classes, this lake and the downtown, and the mountains, and it was this great sort of snowy, snow-capped peaks that were around me on both sides. It was magnificent. And it felt as though in that moment my life had somehow been changed. And I didn't totally understand it yet, but I felt like something had happened inside me. I'd been converted. And I'll talk about conversion in just a minute. Part of the reason that I had been so converted is that didn't yet totally grapple or had grasped the ways in which I had this connection. I had a connection to the story. Michael Gilmore's story is about his brother's crime. My own book, which will come along years after this fact, begins with the very brutal murder of a close friend of mine when I was in high school in Houston, Texas. And I can talk more about that either later on today or tonight after the reading. And the story resonated with me so clearly and so deeply. I felt like this is a genre in which I had to work. So I climbed down from my roof, I went back inside my room, and I sat down and I began to write the story for the first time of what had happened to my friend, to his family, to my family, and the ways in which I was affected by it. It became one of the first things that I ever published way, way, way back when. It only took 12 years for it to become the book that is up there now, A Door in the Ocean. A blink of an eye, right? But truthfully, I worked on it for a very long time. And I worked on this book in a number of stages. And for a while, I thought that it was a book of essays. And so I wrote these discrete little pieces that would meditate on one theme after another, one of which was the murder, another which was my parents' divorce in the 1980s, and there were things like the year that my wife and I had our first son and were so broke, we made less than $8,000 a year, which is not that easy when you're married and have a child. And these themes sort of piled up until I felt like I had a book worth of material. And then once I did, I had to go back and rewrite the entire thing as a memoir. So I feel like I've engaged this material through two sides of the memoir genre. First as nonfiction or personal essays, and then later on as a complete story. And if you like, we could talk about that, how I made that transition. But along the way, I figured out a couple of key things, and now we get to some of the things that are on the handout, about how memoirs work. And if you're thinking about using your own story and putting it into something that is memoir-like, whether it's a nonfiction essay, personal essay, or a book-length memoir, here are a couple things that you can keep in mind. And I begin with this quotation from William Gass, the writer William Gass, which appeared, was it in the New Yorker or in Harper's? Maybe it was in Harper's, a long time ago. Why is it so exciting to say, now that everyone knows it anyway? I was born, I was born, I was born. I pooped in my pants, I was betrayed, I made straight A's. From an essay called The Art of Self, Autobiography in an Age of Narcissism. And this kind of criticism arises every couple of years. The New York Times will run an omnibus review of whatever hot new memoirs are out, and then someone will come along and can it and say, memoir is all about narcissism, and it's all about navel-gazing, and it's all about looking into one's own mirror. Other people will come along and say, the only thing that the memoirist does that is remotely creative is something akin to shining a flashlight in one ear and then writing down whatever is projected out the other side. As though that's the only artistry that is involved, just recording whatever happened in a life. As though you can simply draw a chronology, and if the chronology is exciting, then the book will be exciting. If you read enough memoirs, you quickly learn that that is not the case at all. There are plenty of boring memoirs that are out there. And there are also plenty of really wonderfully exciting memoirs that are rooted in very ordinary lives. So how do you do it? One of the things my students worry about all the time is how can they write nonfiction when they haven't had a big traumatic life? If you're not a refugee from a war-torn country, or you're not the survivor of a trauma, or you haven't been a roadie for the Rolling Stones or Aerosmith or something like that. How do you compose a memoir? Well, it's not so much about the material as it is how you handle the material, how you use it. And I have two amino acids of memoir. This is on the handout. Two things that I think root all memoirs together. By looking inward, the memoir looks outward. Every memoir has to obey this in some way, shape, or form. It's not simply a story of a personal experience or a personal life. It is a story of the personal life that is a lens through which we see other phenomena. Historical, cultural, spiritual, political, etc. One of the reasons why army generals write memoirs and politicians write memoirs is that they say, essentially, I am the lens through which we view this political, geopolitical, or historical moment. So there I was. I'm a witness to whatever these events are. In fact, I think Pope John Paul II's memoir is called Witness to History. So there you go. I mean, I am the lens through which we can see this moment that we live in. All memoirs have to do that one way or another. Does it have to be about the war? Of course not. It can be something much smaller. For me, it became about the sort of violent moment that I had been part of, and how that then affected my faith. And faith became the centerpiece of the story that I was then trying to tell. And along the way, the story of faith became a picture of what contemporary American Southwestern evangelicalism looks like. And I'd read a number of texts that dealt with evangelical people, the zealous, the believers. And most of the time I felt like the people in those stories were treated unfairly. They were lampooned, they were mocked, or they were overly defended. They could be written by someone who is more interested in making an apology for the faith rather than telling the story. I wanted to give a picture of what this world looked like. That was, sound like Fox News, fair and balanced. But really that was interesting and idiosyncratic and nuanced. I could show you both sides. So by telling my own story, I could look outward and look at the other stories that were around me. And ironically, it's almost a case that the more personal the story is, the more it can look outward. By telling more of the details, as difficult as they were, the more the story was projected outward and could give a more nuanced and balanced picture of what the world in which I lived in looked like. One of the biggest struggles that I had moving from essays to memoir is that I had to get a lot more personal. The dirty laundry had to come out and hang on the line. And I tell you, it is really difficult to do that. It causes great emotional strain. And many a night went by that I sat on my couch and worried with my wife that I was being too personal or too private. And she said, just keep going, keep writing the story, keep going forward. By the time that I did, I felt like at least I had the story honestly told. And I would walk my dog around my neighborhood for weeks after I finished the book while my agent was reading it and then while editors were reading it. And I thought, whatever happens, at least I haven't lied. At least I didn't pull the punches. I told an honest story. And then when it sold, my editor said, you need to be more honest than this. I said, I can't believe you're saying that. I've already been so honest. He said, no, we're going to do this a bit more. And I ended up adding another 70 pages to the book even after I had sold it, which was a whole nother struggle. And in the weeks and months since the book has come out, I've had more people than I anticipated email me and say, I read the story and it really connected to me. And they were talking about those points or those moments where I had wanted to be evasive, to cut out, to not put in the story because I felt like they were too personal. By looking inward, the memoir looks outward. It connects to people because it feels like it speaks to their shared experience, their private moments. Number two, and this one is perhaps a bit more controversial, but I still stand by it. Every memoir is a conversion story. Every memoir tells a story of how a person becomes someone different. And this can be refracted through a number of different lenses. In the traditional Judeo-Christian sense, it is simply the conversion of, it is simply the conversion of the life before belief to the life after belief has entered. The life before the religious life, the life after the conversion has occurred. This is Augustine's trope. Most of you have probably seen this in one way, shape, or form. As people of faith, we've all sort of had this story told to us or have told it ourselves probably 1,000 times at minimum. You tell your conversion story. That is the sort of basic building block of a memoir. However, it doesn't always have to be about faith, nor does it have to be about how I endured the traumatic event and then moved past it and became a different version of myself. It can be about simply understanding my material in a different way. The comic memoir. If you ever read someone like David Sedaris, who shows up in The New Yorker all the time, I mean, he fits into this trope in that he gives us a distance between the world that he's talking about and the world that he is now writing from. One of my favorite pieces of his is the Santaland Diaries, which is one of his most famous, in which he was a Santa's elf at Macy's during Christmas time. One of the things that makes that so funny is that you know that the writer is no longer still a Santa's elf. There is a conversion from the self that was to the self that is. And Dante scholar John Picero gives us the best formula that I've ever found to summarize this. I am I, but I was not always so. I am who I say I am. And I am the person who begins this story. I am the author of this story. But I was not always the person who I am now. This is the story of how I became the person who I am now. At some point, I was converted in one way or another. And that conversion can be as simple as I grew up, I got a job, I moved out of my parents' house, I made money, and all the things that happened to me that were funny along the way became part of my past. Or it can be a real conversion. I didn't believe, I was lost, and now I am found. And once I understood that, once I grasped that, it gave me a sense of how to orient myself to the telling of the story. It gives you, as you might think about it, a north and south pole for your story. What's the south pole? Where I was. And where's the north pole? Where I am now. How do you get from point A to point B? How do you get from the south pole to the north pole? That is what the story is trying to tell. And so in my own memoir, In A Door of the Ocean, it opens with a very traumatic scene, the death of my friend, which is a very difficult one to write. As it travels through the story, I keep coming back to that scene, that moment. And one of the great insights of writing this book was that I had to grapple with the fact that the death of my friend really did affect me in ways that I hadn't quite anticipated. As I'm writing the story, I'm learning about myself, which was really surprising. Until I get to a moment in 2007 when my younger son is born. And the pregnancy was complicated and difficult. And when he comes into the world, he has trouble with his lungs. And we find ourselves in the neonatal intensive care unit in Wisconsin, where we had just recently moved. And it's sitting there beside his bed in the neonatal intensive care that I felt like the weight of all the things I had been worried about for the last 15 years come back to me. And there they are, sort of sitting there in my hands, my heart, my hand, as it were. One of the great insights of the story was understanding that those two things were connected. And so the scene in which I'm sitting by Hayden's bed, thinking about my life, my faith, my family, where I had come, becomes that North Pole. At last, I am I. But I was not always so. It took me my whole life to get to this point, and now I see where I am. Every memoir is a conversion story. And this happens not just in the big story, but within the space of the little story. Here is the story of the time I studied abroad, which some of you I think have probably already done. I didn't know my way around Morocco or Milan until suddenly I met the old lady who said, "Oh, come over here and let's have a cappuccino," and she taught me her ways. And then I began to feel more at home there. The conversion happens. There's an upshot. There's a lesson. And there you go. And then finally, I think it's worth mentioning, because I hammer this with my students at Lawrence again and again and again. All stories have two things in common. I call these things amino acids as a way of trying to represent the sort of fundamental building blocks. If you can do these things, then you can do almost anything with narrative. And they are specificity and defamiliarization. Every story must be specific, and it must make the ordinary strange. One of the great temptations with a memoir is to not be specific. There I was when I was in 7th grade, these things happened, rather than honing in on the actual concrete, strange little details. And then to make them strange. And again, this can be ornate, or it can be plain and subtle. It can be the sort of Baroque architecture, or it can be Scandinavian modern. Plain and unadorned, or very ornate. Even the sort of particular telling of the details of a room like the one we're in, cinder block walls and these nice bookshelves and these counters, can come alive if you pay the right attention to them. And one of the biggest mistakes that I think young writers make is that you don't pay enough attention to specificity, scenic, concrete, physical details. One example I use with my students is from the movie Harry Potter, which I'm sure we've all seen. One of the great movies. And I'm thinking of the first movie. What's the first one called? The Sorcerer's Stone. And my favorite scene, and maybe I love it because I went to see it when I was dating my wife. We weren't quite married yet. It was Thanksgiving night. We finished dinner. We go down into the movie theater. When we come out, it's snowing. Could be more romantic. But I love the scene where Hagrid takes Harry for the first time to Diagon Alley. And he taps on those bricks in that little pub, and then they open up, and there they go down that old Dickensian Victorian street with the snow falling and people in their capes and hats. I mean, it's a magical scene. It's really there, not to advance the plot, but to let the reader, or in this case the viewer, enter into the experience of the film, to see this world as different, as magical, as strange. An ordinary street in London becomes suddenly defamiliarized, and we enter into this magical world. And I use this as an example to my students because I want them to understand that you're not simply conveying information. You're trying to provide an experience to the reader. Flannery O'Connor talks about this in Mystery and Manners, that the reader wants to feel like the narrative is unfolding around him. He or she is a part of it, and it's happening and developing as they go. And that's something that I think a lot of young readers have a tendency to miss. If I just convey the information, if I just get the chronology, it's going to be enough. It's the details that really matter. And then to make them strange. And like I've already said, you don't have to make it awkwardly strange. You don't have to conjure strange effects. But it's a way of understanding that something was going on that was different. What is it that we notice in even a plain room? And this isn't happening, but even in a room like a library, what is the different thing that you can hone in on? And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is the sort of basic. The first day back at school is pretty plain and familiar. Everybody has the first day back at school. When I was in high school, a part of my school caught fire, and so they had firemen come and they put it out before it destroyed the whole school. But imagine the story that begins on the first day of school after the school had caught fire. Now you have specific things to really hang your hat on. There's a smell of smoke that still lingers in the air. There's that smell of charred, burnt plastic. There's that sort of tentativeness about what's going to happen. Every time the lights flicker, you wonder if there's a spark somewhere in the wall. The ordinary has been made strange. I'm working on a new book now, which is going to take a long time because I'm still at the very beginning stages of it. But it's set, ironically, in a hospital. My wife is a social worker at a hospital. And I spend my time up there volunteering a couple days a week, just sort of mucking around and paying attention to the little details. And I've trained myself to notice the weird things that are going on. And for example, there's a nurse in her unit who is single, and she had up on the computer the other day her eHarmony profile as I'm sitting there. And you have to bear in mind that in the sort of back of the ICU unit where I was standing, you have sort of very sick patients, some of whom might not survive. And a doctor standing with her arm on this computer, sort of resting it, talking to another nurse about the patient care. But then there's this eHarmony profile. And what are the 5 things that are important to her? My work, my son, my family, Coca-Cola was number 4. And then something like, the Packers or something like that. But Coca-Cola sort of makes the top 5 of things that are most important to her. And that just struck me as kind of funny. That's the kind of thing that you want to make sure you get in there because it gives you a glimpse of what this woman's life must be like. And if you're a nurse who works from 3 a.m. to 3 p.m., you can bet that Coca-Cola is probably pretty darn important. That and espresso and 5-hour energy and whatever else you need to keep yourself awake. So I want to make sure we have time for questions. I know we've only got about 10 or 15 minutes to go. But this is sort of my basic layout for how memoirs work. And if you can pay attention to these things, if you can make your story specific and try to see it as strange, your story is stranger than you think. And again, Flannery O'Connor talks about this. The prophet and the writer must also see the freak. You must be willing to see yourself in those freakish terms and then to write them. And thus, by revealing your personal self, it doesn't have to be vulgar. My students often worry that it means that they have to walk around naked on the page. There's an emotional nakedness that needs to take place. It doesn't have to be a physical nakedness or a sexual nakedness. It can be a sort of private confession of whatever the case. By doing that, the memoir has the ability to project and connect with its audience. And it must be anchored by some sense of conversion. How does it change? How do you become something different? One of the reasons why I think memoirs take a while to write, and we often need distance between the events and the writing of the events, is that you need time to go through, process, and understand the conversion itself. I am now in a place in which I can finally write about this. And sometimes that can happen right after the events, but in most cases it takes time to process. And I know for me it took a long time, but that seems to be the way that it goes. So let me stop and let me take some questions. What things are on your mind? If you don't have any, I will start to call on you at random. Go ahead.
I have a question about the connection between persona and tone, and the difference between a memoir and a piece of fiction, or whether or not there is a difference. If I set out to write a piece of fiction and I say to myself, I want this to be comic, I've got a particular tone I'm going to strive for, so I'm going to create a narrator that enables me to do that. If I'm working with a memoir, I may be a little bit more limited by who I am and what I've experienced. So I'm wondering how you see either differences or similarities between those choices you make in a memoir and those choices you make in a piece of fiction.
You know, I don't know that I see much of a difference between the two, because it's more about perspective. It's more about how you see and embrace the material. You know, and I think that everybody has comedy inside of their lives if they're willing to see it in those terms. You know, I'm a great fan of Seinfeld, which I don't know if you are as well. But one of the sort of magical things about Seinfeld is it's simply about embracing the comedy of the minutiae, or the small. And those times in which I have drifted toward the comedic in my fiction or in my nonfiction, it's usually been around those things. So one time, this didn't make it into the story, but I have a small little essay about my father's awful Christmas presents. When I was in college, every year I used to get a cheese sampler. One year, I swear to God, I got a sleeve of spaghetti and a jar of sauce. A year later, I got a baggie full of change, which was the sum contents of his car's ashtray. He dumped it into a Ziploc bag and wrapped it up in here with my present. In any one moment, that could be seen as really tragic. My parents are divorced. I didn't get to see them all that often. And when I would go, he'd be like, "Oh, you want a present? Here." Seen through another lens, it became something rather funny. And when I amalgamated all of the different crappy Christmas presents I've gotten over the years, which are legion, it starts to seem rather funny. And it's about that sort of movement. Can you, get the comedy to come through those minor details? And I really don't see much of a difference between the two genres about that really at all. Now, I have seen this question, or I have sort of fielded this question about whether or not you can lie in memoir. Is there a place to fictionalize? And I'll sort of give a qualified sometimes. There are those moments in which I feel like we're justified in sort of wandering away from the absolute factual reporting in order to increase comic effect. And I tend to sort of take as my guideline whether or not it's going to affect the overall story or the events themselves. If there were $17 of change versus $11 of change, does it really matter? Not really. You can imagine other events in which the facts do. Go ahead, you have a question.
Actually, that ties in well, because I was going to ask you about the publication process, and because memoirs are sometimes more infamous than famous for embellishment, was there any sort of fact-checking, or did they ask for people who could, corroborate parts of your...
Thankfully, they did not. Because I'm sure there would have been plenty of people who would have argued with me and said that I got something wrong. And to be honest, I was conscious of the fact that my memory was probably limited and flawed, and was itself a recreation. And that's one of the difficult things about writing a memoir, is that you're trying to adhere to these narrative structures with real events. All narratives must fit within a narrative trajectory, or they become boring because you have too much. And if you try to think about all of the different pieces of an event that inform it, you're going to end up with an excessive amount of detail. So you have to edit and select. Dialogue is especially tricky to get right. So usually in that case, I will recreate it. And there's a moment in which I can allow myself to be a bit more comedic, even if it wasn't exactly that way in the moment of the event, or if I didn't receive it that way. Sometimes looking backwards, I can feel sort of more tenderness and thus more comedy toward my past self than I did in the moment. Since most dialogue is a recreation, especially if it's 20 years ago anyway, as long as I've got the right people in the right places, I can allow the sales to come out just a little bit. Some people have, looked at the story and said, well, I don't remember it being quite that way. But most have said, okay, I feel like this is pretty much the way I remember it as well. In some ways, a memoir is sort of like going to see a fortune teller. Fortune tellers can get a lot of things right if they speak in vague and broad enough terms. You have gone through something difficult. You've had a great love in your life. Oh my God, she knows me. By getting the events told well enough, it usually connects close enough to the people who are there, and they feel some sense of connection to it as well. Does that answer your question? Yeah. What else? Hi.
Is that in the way of like creative nonfiction? Like it's the way you tell the story, it's the way you present the information?
Yes.
Kind of?
Yes. The traditional definition of the word essay is to attempt or to try. It is an effort made to understand. If we think about an essayist like Montaigne, he's trying to grapple with questions large and small. And I am of the firm conviction that you can write an essay about anything. Anything. One of my friends, Pat Madden, who teaches ironically at BYU, sold a plastic water bottle on eBay and wrote an essay about that. In fact, he wrote it in eBay. So the auction was itself the sort of essay, which he would have people come in with questions and he would answer in essay form, and it became this sort of very weird experiment in narrative, and then he published the entire thing as an essay. So if a plastic water bottle, a plastic Dasani bottle, in which he's looking at the minutia of the label around the cap itself, I mean, you can't get more tiny than the things he's looking at, can become an essay. Then anything can become an essay. In many ways, that was the challenge that he gave himself. Can you look at the dirt on the floor? And he did, and it was pretty successful. So I think that you can take any material, whatever the case may be, and think about it, meditate on it, use it as a connection to something. I've written essays on words themselves, on the process of finding a name for a child, which is, if you've had a child, one that you will, can be a somewhat vexed experience. And as well as big things. Here's this traumatic world that I was once a part of. Here's this traumatic experience. Here's the summer that I spent living in Australia. Hopefully that helps. Anything else before we run out of time? I know we've only got a few minutes left. Hi.
How do you reconcile yourself to, when you write a memoir, it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to be open about myself, I would put myself out there, but you can't write a memoir without writing intimately about other people, many of whom are alive, and how did you deal with that?
What do you? I wish I had like a great answer for like what I would go through to figure that out. Some writers I know will try to get the person that they're writing about to sign off on it. Is it okay if I write about you in this way? I had to write some pretty difficult things about my family, and that was hard. And I won't sugarcoat it. It caused a fair bit of emotional anguish to think about writing about people that I love and love very much in ways that aren't always so flattering. I felt like I had to do it because I had to tell the truth. And so there was no easy solution. There was no easy answer. And I worried and I worried and I worried about what they would think. And my mother read the book and said she struggled with it at first. And then when she went back through and read it again, she felt like she understood why I had to tell it in the way that I did. The one person for my work who does get some veto power is my wife. So if she reads something and says, oh, I don't think that this is going to work, then I'll usually take it out. But if you were to read it, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff in there about her that she allowed to go forward. Maren, I don't know if you remember this, but when we were at House of Hope in 2009, Patricia Hampel got asked this question,
Yeah.
sitting up in front of the podium at that what they call House of Hope Presbyterian Church. And from the altar, this big Presbyterian church, to this little old lady who sat right down in front, who asked her, how do you deal with the family member that you're writing about? She said, and I won't quote it exactly, but F 'em. I thought, well, if Patricia Hempel can say that from the altar of the church, then maybe I can as well. So in a way, you just have to be gutsy enough, I think, to do it, and then hope that you deal with your people in fair and honest ways. I'm really close with my dad. We talk a couple times a week at least. Now that we have FaceTime with the Mac, we do FaceTime all the time. And some of the hard stuff in the book is about him. And I just felt like I had to write it. And if I could do so honestly and openly and show in the end that the love wins out, then I could take him through some of those hard roads and it would be okay. But I'll be honest, we haven't talked about how he feels about those things. So it's a sort of vexed answer, and I don't have an easy solution for it. Anything else? Are we out of time?
Well, thank you all for
Yes,
coming.
thank you.
Thank you.